The last thing my mother said to me before 20 years of silence was, "You've made your choice. Don't come back." My name is Diane. I was 23 years old that Christmas morning, standing in my parents' kitchen in Cedar Falls, Iowa, holding my 4-month-old daughter against my chest. And I understood in that moment that the family I had spent my entire life trying to be good enough for had just handed me a door and told me to use it. The kitchen smelled the way it always did on Christmas: cinnamon, coffee, the faint ghost of last night's ham, and my mother was standing at the counter in her blue wool cardigan, not looking at me, refilling her coffee cup with the deliberate calm of someone who has made a decision and intends to live inside it. I was a pediatric nurse at the time, or I was becoming one. I'd had to put my final clinical rotation on hold when Maya arrived 7 weeks early in August, a small, furious fact of a person who had spent 11 days in the NICU and come out the other side with perfect lungs and my grandmother's chin. I wasn't married. Maya's father, a man named Curtis who worked at the hardware store and had kind eyes and a consistent inability to stay, had left at the 4-month mark with the quiet efficiency of someone who had never fully intended to stay. That part one had mostly accepted. What I had not anticipated was my parents. My father, Franklin, was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around his mug, looking out the window at the gray Iowa morning. He was 61 at the time, a retired high school principal, a man who had spent 30 years projecting authority and had come to confuse it with wisdom. My mother, Loretta, was 59, a woman who had organized her entire life around the opinions of people she'd grown up with, people who went to the same church, shopped at the same grocery store, attended the same holiday parties. A grandchild born outside marriage to a man who was already gone was not something that fit inside the story she told about her family. The ultimatum had been building since August. I had felt it gathering the way you feel a weather system move in, the lowering pressure, the specific quality of silences over the phone, the way my mother said, "Of course, we'll be there," when I called from the hospital about Maya's early arrival, and then wasn't. She had a cold, she said. She didn't want to bring germs to a preemie. I had believed her because I needed to. On Christmas morning, the weather finally arrived. "Your father and I have talked about this," my mother said, setting her coffee cup down with the precise placement of someone who has rehearsed this. "We can't be associated with this situation. You understand that. This situation." That was her word for her granddaughter. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said. My voice was very steady, which surprised me. Maya was asleep against my chest, her breath warm through my shirt. "We're asking you to make an arrangement," my father said, still looking at the window. "An adoption. There are good families. Good Christian families who can provide." "No," I said. The word landed in the kitchen and stayed there. My mother turned to look at me then, and her expression was not angry. That was the thing I still remember. It wasn't anger. It was the expression of someone closing an account. Final, administrative, done. "Then we're done," she said. "You've made your choice." I picked up Maya's diaper bag from the floor beside the table. I put on my coat with one hand while holding my daughter with the other, and I walked out of that kitchen through the back door, across the frozen driveway, and into the car I'd borrowed from my friend Gwen. I drove 13 blocks to the apartment I'd been renting since September, and I sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine running and Maya sleeping in her car seat, and I did not cry. I don't know why I didn't cry. I think I was too busy rearranging the architecture of everything I thought my life was supposed to look like. That was December 25th, 2003. The knock on my door came on October 14th, 2023. 20 years, 9 months, and 19 days later. I know the number because I counted. The first year without them was the hardest, and also, though I couldn't see it at the time, the most honest. I went back to nursing school in January, 4 months after Maya was born, with her in a second-hand bouncy seat in the corner of my study while I read pharmacology textbooks at the kitchen table at midnight. My clinical coordinator, a woman named Ruth who had 3 grown children and a direct manner I eventually came to love, made accommodations I hadn't asked for and didn't know were possible. I graduated in May 2005. I was hired at Cedar Falls Regional that fall. I was 24 years old with a 2-year-old daughter and a nursing license and a studio apartment, and I remember the particular feeling of that autumn, the cold coming in off the Iowa fields, the smell of turning leaves, the specific physical sensation of a life that was entirely and only mine. It wasn't easy. I want to be honest about that, because the story of a woman who breaks from her family and immediately flourishes is a cleaner story than the truth. The truth involved months of financial panic, Maya's ear infections and the choice between the copay and groceries, the relentless logistics of single parenthood, and a grief that sat in my chest like something I hadn't unpacked yet. Not grief for my parents specifically, but for the version of my life in which they had risen to the occasion instead of handing me a door. I had Gwen. She had been my best friend since sophomore year of high school, and in those first months she was present in the practical, daily way that matters most, bringing meals, watching Maya on clinical days, sitting with me on the floor of my apartment at 10 o'clock on weekday nights when the exhaustion was a physical weight. I trusted her completely. That trust was, it would turn out, not entirely well placed, though I wouldn't learn the shape of that for years. What I understood clearly, even then, was that my parents had made a calculation, their social standing versus their daughter. They had run the numbers and come to a clean conclusion. What I didn't understand yet, what would take me a decade to fully articulate, was that this calculation had been the operating logic of my entire childhood. I had spent 23 years performing their preferences, the right grades, the right activities, the right presentation of myself at church and school, and the houses of people they cared about impressing. I had been good at it. I had mistaken being good at it for being loved. That realization didn't arrive fully formed. It came in pieces over years, the way large things usually do. Maya grew into a child with strong opinions about everything, her shoes, her cereal, which library books she wanted read twice. She was funny in a dry, observational way that appeared around age 4 and never left. She had my grandmother's chin and Curtis's easy laugh, and something that was entirely her own, some quality of self-possession that I watched develop with a mixture of pride and something that felt like relief. She didn't know what she'd almost not been. I intended to tell her when she was older, in the honest and unmystified way that I intended to tell her everything. When Maya was 7, she asked about my parents. She'd heard me on the phone with my Aunt Sandra, my mother's younger sister, the one family connection I'd maintained, and had caught enough to understand that grandparents existed somewhere. "Why don't I know them?" she asked. I sat down with her at the kitchen table, and I told her as much of the truth as a 7-year-old can hold, that her grandparents had made a decision a long time ago that hurt me very much, and that I had decided to protect her from people who might hurt her the same way. She considered this with the grave attention she gave everything. Did they know they were being mean? I thought about my mother's face on that Christmas morning. The administrative finality of it. "Yes," I said. "I think they did." She nodded and went back to her drawing. I sat there for a moment after, feeling something settle in me, some version of the story I'd been telling myself, now tested against the simplest possible question and found to be true. At work, I had developed into a nurse that younger staff came to with questions, not because I sought authority, but because I'd put in the years and kept my attention on the right things. My department head, a man named Dr. Okafor who had the rarest quality of genuine interest in people, had suggested twice that I consider a charge nurse role. I declined twice, not from lack of confidence, but from a clear-eyed understanding of where my energy actually needed to go. Maya was 9, then 11. There would be time. The signs I missed in those early years were not about my parents. They were about Gwen. The first thing I noticed was a card. Maya was 12, which put the year at 2015. I was clearing out the storage closet in the hallway, the kind of periodic archaeology that reveals forgotten objects from every layer of your past, when I found a birthday card from Gwen. Standard enough. But tucked inside it, fallen from something else and barely visible against the closet's back wall, was a handwritten note on the small cream stationery my mother had always used. I recognized the handwriting before I recognized what I was holding. The note was 5 lines. My mother's careful forward-leaning cursive, to Gwen, dated 2007, 4 years after Christmas, for years into the silence. It thanked Gwen for keeping us informed and said she was glad to know that Diane and the child were managing, and expressed hope that the situation might resolve itself in time. I stood in the hallway with that note and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. Keeping us informed. I put the note in my pocket. I closed the closet. I made dinner. I helped Maya with her homework. I did not call Gwen. I didn't call her for 3 days, during which I turned the 5 lines over in my mind with the systematic attention of someone cataloging damage. What had she reported? For how long? My parents had cut me off entirely, no contact, no birthday cards, nothing, but they had apparently been receiving updates through my best friend for at least 4 years, possibly longer. Possibly always. I thought about specific conversations Gwen and I had had during those years. The ones where I'd been most raw about money, about exhaustion, about the particular loneliness of raising a child entirely alone. I thought about her careful, sympathetic listening, and I wondered how much of that sympathy had been genuine and how much had been the attentiveness of someone who was also taking notes. Something shifted in me during those 3 days. Not the sudden break of a betrayal discovered, but the slower, colder understanding of a pattern finally made visible. I wasn't afraid of what I'd find if I asked. I was afraid of what it would mean for a friendship I'd built my early adulthood around. When I finally called her, I read her the note over the phone without preamble. The pause that followed was long enough to answer the question before she spoke. "Diane," she started. "How long?" Another pause. "Your mother called me. In January of 2004. She wanted to know how you were." She was worried. She was worried, I repeated. She told me not to come back, and then she was worried. "She's still your mother." She. How long, Gwen? The answer, when it came, was, until about 2010. 7 years. She had called it care, she said. She had told herself she was a bridge, a connection point, that she was helping without hurting. She had told my mother about Maya's NICU stay recovery, about the apartment, about my graduation, about Curtis not being involved. She had, in 7 years of careful reporting, given my parents the ability to monitor my life from a safe distance while maintaining the punishment of their absence. I understood, somewhere in that phone call, that there are people who stay in your life not because they're loyal to you, but because they're loyal to the idea of you, and those two things are not the same. Gwen had loved me. I believe that. She had also loved my parents, loved being trusted by them, loved the particular role of conduit and confidant that the situation had assigned her. When those two loyalties pulled in different directions, she had chosen the one that came with approval from people who represented something she wanted to be close to. Looking back now, the red flags had been there. The way Gwen sometimes echoed my mother's phrasings without realizing it. The way she occasionally shifted the conversation away from my anger at my parents and toward understanding their position, reframing their behavior with a sympathy that I'd attributed to her general fairness. The way she had, in 2005, gently suggested that bridges didn't have to be burned forever at a moment when I had said nothing about burning anything. I called those things her perspective. They were something else. I didn't end the friendship in that phone call. I'm not sure I ended it at any single moment. What happened was more gradual, a cooling, a repositioning, a recalibration of what I told her and what I kept. The friendship became something smaller and more careful, and Gwen, to her credit, didn't pretend not to notice. We still spoke, but I stopped treating her as the person who held the full weight of my life. I moved that weight somewhere safer. The place I moved it was mostly myself. By the time Maya was in high school, I had built something I hadn't known I was building. Not a wall. Walls are defensive structures, passive, you stand behind them and hope the threat doesn't find a way over. What I had built was more like a foundation, the ability to know my own mind, to trust my own assessments, to notice when someone's version of events didn't match my experience and to hold my experience as the primary text. That capacity had not come naturally. It had been assembled over years from the specific material of everything my parents' household had required me to suppress. Franklin and Loretta had operated by a consistent internal logic that I had not named as a child because I hadn't had the language for it yet. The family's appearance was more important than the family's reality. Feelings that complicated the appearance were to be managed. Conflicts that threatened the appearance were to be resolved in favor of the appearance. A daughter's crisis was evaluated first and primarily through the lens of what it would look like. Once I named that logic, I could see it everywhere in my childhood. The way certain subjects simply didn't exist in our house, not forbidden, just absent, smoothed over by my mother's practiced social navigation. The way my father's authority was never questioned aloud, so that disagreement had to be expressed as agreement with qualifications, slowly and carefully, like someone removing weight from a structure they weren't sure would hold. I had been trained in the management of surfaces. It had taken me years to unlearn it. My Aunt Sandra had stayed in my life throughout, the one thread of family connection I hadn't cut or had cut by. She visited once a year, always in spring, always bearing the specific gifts of someone who is trying to be present in the absence of others. She never spoke badly of my parents to me, but she also never defended them, and that careful neutrality had always felt like a form of acknowledgement. In 2018, she told me something that shifted the way I understood the full geography of what had happened. "Your mother reached out to me in 2019, she said, over coffee in my kitchen. She asked whether you might be open to contact." I set my cup down. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that was your decision, and she'd have to ask you herself." Sandra looked at her hands. "I don't think she was ready to do that yet. But she's been thinking about it." "For how long?" "I think for a long time," Sandra said quietly. "Longer than she'd admit to." I sat with that for a while, and what I felt was not what I expected. Not warmth, not longing. A kind of careful attention, the way you pay attention to something that could be significant or could be nothing. My parents were 77 and 75. They had missed 20 years. They had missed Maya's first word and her first day of school and her high school graduation and the way she laughed, the particular laugh that stopped rooms. They had made a calculation and lived inside it, and if they were beginning to reassess, that was information. But it was not yet a request, and a reassessment is not an apology. I did not reach out. I went on with my life. That was 2019. The same year, Maya started her second year at the University of Iowa, studying psychology, a choice that had made me laugh and also made complete sense. She called twice a week, had opinions about everything, and had developed into a person I genuinely liked, which is not a given and not a small thing. She knew the outline of the family story. I had told her at 15, more fully than at 7, and she had processed it with the same grave attention she'd brought to everything since childhood. "Do you miss them?" she had asked me then. "I miss who I thought they were," I said. "I don't think I ever really knew who they were." She considered that for a long time. "That's sadder, actually." She was right. It was. In the fall of 2022, Patrick came into my life, a quietly direct man who taught middle school science and had been divorced for 4 years and had 2 daughters he was raising with steady, unglamorous devotion. We met at a school fundraiser, talked for 3 hours, and continued the conversation for the next 8 months before either of us used a word that had any weight to it. He knew about my parents from the beginning. He had the patience of someone who understood that some histories require time to explain and more time to be believed. He was sitting at my kitchen table on the morning of October 14, 2023, when the knock came at the front door. I knew before I opened the door. Not because I'd been warned Sandra hadn't called, nobody had called, but because there is a quality to certain knocks that carries information in its rhythm. Tentative and deliberate at the same time. The knock of someone who has rehearsed the moment of arrival and is less certain about what comes after. I opened the door, and there were my parents. Franklin was 71 now, and the authority he had once worn like a second suit had thinned considerably. He looked smaller than I remembered, not diminished exactly, but returned to human scale. Loretta was in a coat I didn't recognize, gray wool, her hair almost entirely white. She was holding a small wrapped package that she was gripping with both hands, the way people grip things when they don't know what to do with their hands. I stood in the doorway and I looked at them. "Diane," my mother said. Her voice was careful in a new way, not the administrative carefulness of the Christmas kitchen, but the carefulness of someone who knows they are not owed an open door and is standing in front of one anyway. "How did you find my address?" I asked. Not hostile. Genuinely curious. Sandra, my father said. Of course. Sandra, who had maintained her careful neutrality for 20 years and had apparently decided, at some point, that neutrality had run its course. You should come in, I said. I don't know why I said that. I had imagined this moment in various forms over the years, not obsessively, but occasionally, the way you turn over hypotheticals that seem distant and then suddenly aren't. I had never imagined myself saying come in quite so quickly. Patrick appeared in the hallway behind me, read the situation with the accuracy of a man paying attention, and quietly excused himself upstairs with a tact I was grateful for. We sat in the living room, my parents on the sofa, me in the armchair. The package sat on the coffee table between us, still wrapped, and nobody acknowledged it. My father spoke first. He was not a man who had ever found apology natural, and what he produced was not, technically, an apology. It was a reckoning, a careful, halting account of how he and my mother had made a decision that they had defended for years and had eventually been unable to continue defending. He talked for about 5 minutes. He did not use the word wrong. He used the phrase not what we should have done twice, which was, I understood, the maximum available distance he could travel in that direction. My mother was quieter. She looked at her hands for most of it. When she finally looked up at me, her expression was one I hadn't seen on her face before, not the closed account expression from the kitchen, not the careful social composure she'd worn my whole life. Something more exposed. Something that required more effort to maintain than composure usually does. We missed everything, she said. 3 words that were not an apology either, but were something. I had thought, during the years when I'd occasionally imagined this conversation, that I would feel a specific way, either the opening of something long closed, or the clean confirmation that it was too late, the door too long shut to reopen. What I actually felt was neither. I felt clear. A particular clarity that comes not from having decided, but from knowing yourself well enough to observe your own reactions without being surprised by them. I want you to understand something, I said. I kept my voice even because I meant it to be even, not from suppression, but from genuine steadiness. I have a good life. I have a daughter who is extraordinary, a partner I trust, work I'm proud of. None of that happened because of you. I want you to understand that clearly. My mother nodded. She pressed her lips together in a way I recognized from childhood, the gesture that meant she was holding something back. But she didn't look away. We know, my father said. I'm not asking you to perform 20 years of regret, I continued. I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in, if you want to be in my life at all, is honesty. Not the appearance of honesty, actual honesty. About what you did and why you did it and what it cost. Another silence. The package sat between us, still wrapped. There's something else, my mother said, finally. She looked at the package. I've been holding it for years. Sandra told me I had to bring it in person or not at all. I opened it. Inside was a photograph album, small, the kind with cloth covers, and inside the album were photographs I had never seen. Maya's birth announcement, cut from the local paper. A photograph of me at my nursing school graduation, taken from a distance, almost covert. Maya at what appeared to be a school event, 7 or 8 years old, photographed from across a parking lot. My mother at a distance, watching her granddaughter from 50 feet away, unable to approach. I sat with the album open in my lap for a long time. They had been watching. From a distance, through Sandra and through Gwen and through the careful collection of whatever fragments reached them, they had been watching for 20 years. They had maintained the punishment and the surveillance simultaneously. They had held the distance and the longing at the same time for 2 decades and called it a principle. I understood something then that I hadn't fully understood before. The ultimatum on Christmas morning had not been about me. It had been about their fear of judgment, of exposure, of the opinion of people they'd organized their entire identities around impressing. They had sacrificed their daughter and their grandchild on the altar of a reputation that probably nobody else cared as much about as they did. And they had carried that sacrifice like a moral position, right up until the moment they couldn't carry it anymore. That's what fear does when it's never named. It disguises itself as principle. It lets you believe you made a choice when really you were just running. I'll need time, I said, closing the album. I'm not closing the door. but I need time." My mother nodded. My father looked at his hands. They left 40 minutes later, back down the front walk to the rental car they'd driven from Cedar Falls in from the house I'd grown up in, which was still standing, apparently, on the same street. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. Patrick came downstairs without being called. He sat beside me on the bottom step and didn't say anything, just handed me a glass of water, which was exactly the right thing. Even now, when I return to that scene in my memory, it doesn't feel like triumph and it doesn't feel like tragedy. It feels like the ending of something that should have ended differently, arriving late but arriving. Maya came home for Thanksgiving that year, 6 weeks after my parents' visit. I told her before she arrived, by phone, so she'd have time to process it before she walked through the door. She was quiet during the call in the particular way she got quiet when she was thinking rather than reacting. When she spoke, she said, "Do you want them back in your life?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I think I want to find out who they are now and decide from that. What if they're still the same people? Then I'll know that, and I'll have my answer." She came home and she slept in her old room, and we made pie together in the kitchen on Wednesday night, flour on the counter, the radio on. At some point she said, "I think you should let me decide whether I want to meet them. It's my call too." She was right. It was. I called my parents in December and told them that Maya was willing to speak with them once on her own terms. That if it went well, we would proceed carefully and honestly, and that I was not offering reconciliation, I was offering the possibility of one. That the condition was accountability, not performance. That I would be watching for the difference. My father said, "That's fair." It was the most honest thing I'd heard him say in my entire life. The meeting with Maya happened in January, at a coffee shop in Iowa City, and I was not there for it. Maya had asked me not to be, and I respected that. She came home that evening and made tea and sat at the kitchen table and told me it had gone adequately, which in Maya's vocabulary was a passing grade. "Your father cried," she said. "He never used to," I said. "People change," she said. "Sometimes." I had been in therapy on and off since 2015. Not continuously, but at intervals, the way you check the structural integrity of something important. My therapist had said something years earlier that I kept returning to, that healing from a controlling family dynamic doesn't mean forgiving the people who controlled you. It means recovering the self they required you to set aside. It means locating, piece by piece, the version of yourself that existed before you learned to manage appearances. I had been doing that for 20 years without knowing it had a name. Patrick and I got engaged in the spring. Not dramatically over dinner at home, a quiet conversation that arrived at its conclusion naturally, the way the best decisions do. Maya texted him 17 exclamation points when we told her, which was the highest possible expression of approval in her vocabulary. I went back to Cedar Falls once, to the house on my parents' street, not to go inside, but to stand across the road for a few minutes. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. Maybe just the fact of it, the ordinary brick exterior of a house where a particular story had taken place. It looked smaller than memory. Houses usually do. My parents and I talk now once or twice a month. Not warmly, not yet, perhaps not ever in the way I'd have wished for at 23. But honestly, my mother has said things I didn't expect her to say. My father has been quietly consistent in a way that costs him something, and I can see it costing him, and I give him credit for paying it. What we are building is not the family I lost on Christmas morning 2003. It is something different, smaller and more careful, built on the honest terms of what we actually are to each other rather than the performed terms of what we were supposed to be. Maya makes her own decisions about them. That was always going to be how it had to be. I am 43 years old. I work at the same hospital where I started 19 years ago, in a charge nurse role I finally accepted 2 years ago when it became clear that the timing was right and I was ready. I have a daughter I am genuinely proud of and a partner I trust and a life that is, in all the ways that matter, entirely mine. I think about the woman who stood in that parking lot on Christmas afternoon 2003, not crying, rearranging the architecture of everything. She didn't know what she was capable of yet. She was about to find out. Some doors, when they're closed in your face, turn out to be the ones you needed to stop standing in front of. What this story is really about, underneath the ultimatum, the surveillance, the late arriving knock, is the particular damage of conditional love. Not the dramatic damage of cruelty or violence, but the quieter, more durable damage of love that comes with terms attached. Franklin and Loretta loved their daughter. That part, I think, was real. But their love had always operated through a filter. What does this cost us? What does this look like? What will people say? Love processed through that filter becomes something else, a tool for compliance, a reward contingent on performance. And the person on the receiving end of that love doesn't always know it's conditional until the conditions are violated. Diane spent 23 years being excellent at meeting the conditions. The crisis wasn't that she failed, it was that the conditions themselves were revealed as what they always were: prioritizations. Her parents, faced with the reality of her life, chose the filter. They chose the appearance. And they called it a principle so they could live with it. The surveillance detail, the photograph album, the distance watching, the updates channeled through Gwen, reveals something specific about how guilt functions inside a defended position. Franklin and Loretta could not acknowledge what they'd done and could not stop caring about the person they'd done it to, so they created a third option. They watched. They maintained the punishment and the connection simultaneously, at a safe remove, for 20 years. That isn't moral coherence. It's the behavior of people who know they're wrong and can't afford to admit it yet. Gwen's betrayal operates on a different frequency. She wasn't cruel. She was a person who loved two things and, when pressed, chose the one that came with more approval. The thing that makes her choice particularly instructive is how thoroughly she rationalized it as care, as bridge building, as being helpful to everyone simultaneously. That rationalization is familiar because it's common. We tell ourselves we're keeping the peace when we're actually choosing sides. We call it loyalty to everyone when we're serving our own need to remain in good standing with the powerful. What Diane built in 20 years was not a recovery from a wound. It was a self. The controlling household had required her to be a managed version of herself, and when the management infrastructure collapsed on Christmas morning, she had to learn, from scratch, who she actually was without it. That process, slow, unglamorous, conducted in parallel with nursing shifts and ear infections and midnight textbooks, produced a woman who knew her own mind, trusted her own assessments, and could stand in her doorway 20 years later and feel clear rather than shattered. The photograph album is the story's sharpest detail, because it means they always knew what they were missing. They had chosen to miss it anyway, and then documented the missing. That is a particular kind of self-punishment inflicted on themselves, yes, but also on Diane and on Maya, who grew up without grandparents because two people were too frightened of their neighbors' opinions to be grandparents. The cost of that fear was distributed unevenly. It always is. What I keep coming back to is the photograph album. 20 years of photographs of a granddaughter they watched from parking lots and school events and across distances they'd chosen. They could have closed that distance at any point. They didn't until they did. I think that's what we don't talk about enough. The way pride and fear can look identical from the inside. You think you're holding a position. Really, you're just too scared to move. And by the time you realize the difference, the years have already gone. If there's anything this story asks of the people listening, it's this: don't wait until there's nothing left to protect to finally be honest. The people you're protecting your image from, most of them aren't watching as closely as you think. And the people you're actually losing? They notice every single day.